Thank you very much, Condi. We are so delighted, Terry and I, to have the support of the Hoover Institution behind this program. I can't imagine a better host for it. So, because I'm newer to speaking, I still use notes. And my notes say that I should start out by reminding you. So on Earth Day 20 years ago, The Economist magazine featured a story. And the story it featured was about rescuing environmentalism. And the argument in it was that the market forces could be the environment's best friend if only Greens would learn to embrace it. So this would be an alternative, market forces, to the old playbook of litigating and mandating and regulating. And so this raises, to me, questions that are going to be addressed throughout the day. Questions like, have environmentalists started to embrace markets? Is that happening in the last 20 years? Have markets become more prominent in environmental policy? Why or why not? Have politicians, bureaucrats embraced them? And how have markets performed compared to mandates? So I'll offer a few thoughts on these, and then I'll these questions and then segue into the session with Gary Libecap and PJ Hill. When this article came out, I was starting a PhD program about 20 years ago. And so I was familiar with all the arguments, the textbook arguments in economics about why markets fail and why they would come short of providing the kinds of environmental amenities and environmental quality that people value. And the basic argument in a nutshell was that transaction costs were too high for markets to do these things. And I would say that in the last 20 years, the case for markets has strengthened. It's only strengthened. And it's strengthened largely, I think, because of new technologies that are lowering transaction costs. So 2005 was kind of the stone age of technology. I think my professors who were telling me about market failure, some of them are doing so on overhead projectors with, plastic sheets. And, and then I would call my wife on my flip phone and say, this argument seems so sterile and old. New technologies have made it easier to connect buyers with sellers. And that's what you need for markets to work, and buyers of environmental quality with sellers of environmental quality. So technology is what provides a pathway for the enviropreneurs to do their work, to solve problems that mandates have proved incapable of solving. There's lots of examples of this, but one that I like that I'll summarize is called the Flyway Program by the Nature Conservancy. So the problem is you have these shorebirds that migrate large distances across continents, and they need wetland habitat at certain times that are unpredictable until the time is close, in certain places that are unknown until the time is close. So what has the Nature Conservancy done? Well, it uses crowdsourced data from birders all over the globe to learn where the birds are at certain times. And then it contacts landowners and then asks them through a reverse auction to bid on what they would need to be paid to flood their fields at the right time in the right place to provide the habitat for the birds. And so this is, I think, a fantastic example of technologies enabling market transactions that really weren't feasible with mandates. Generally, I think this ease of connecting buyers and sellers has led to a bigger movement in the last 20 years where environmental markets are becoming more prominent both in the US and globally. You hear more about them in a session on the potential and limits of environmental markets. Certainly there's markets for carbon. They are taking advantage of new technologies. They don't always work, and there's some problems, but this is a trend that's prominent and I don't think going away. But there's signs that other environmental groups still embrace the old playbook of litigate, regulate, mandate. There's several groups like Earth Justice and Sierra Club spend a lot of money annually to litigate. And I view this as a zero-sum game. You spend all that money over time. What's the opportunity cost? What if it had been invested in buying assets for the environment, For example, if all that money spent litigating would have been used to buy coal deposits and retire them, would those groups have a lot more to show for their effort? So those are the kind of comparisons we think about in this Markets versus Mandates program. But the old playbook is popular because politicians, bureaucrats are pretty willing to oblige. Globally, in the US, at the state level, at the federal level, mandates are common. Many jurisdictions ban plastic carryouts, for example. 11 states have committed to ban gas-powered vehicles by 2035. The list of federal mandates since 2005 is also long, especially with the rise of executive orders. The Biden administration declared swaths of public land off limits to oil and gas development. It created marine reserves that were off limits to commercial fishing, created rules limiting waterfall from showerheads. So these are mandates. The Trump administration has reversed those, but it's showing a proclivity to use its own mandates as well. There's a forthcoming ban on red dye number 3 in food products. So this is not trusting consumers to choose the risks they undertake. There is not as of yet, as I know of, a mandate on the number of dowels that families can own, but that may be forthcoming. The Trump administration has banned paper straws in federal contracts. This is a follow-up to the Biden administration, which banned plastic straws in federal contracts. And so I hate paper straws, but I love consumer sovereignty, so I'm kind of torn with this. Globally, mandates on carbon are much more common than market approaches. Both exist, though. There's mixes of mandates, markets, and hybrids. Creates research opportunities to compare and contrast what's better, when, how. So how do we compare the two? What criteria do we use? Well, Terry and I like to say that we follow the advice in this Markets versus Mandates program of Hoover Fellow Thomas Sowell. And he basically said, policy should be judged on the incentives that policy creates, not the hopes that inspire it. So a lot of environmental policy is inspired by hopes without a ton of careful thought or a lot of political lobbying in terms of the incentives that it will create. So specifically, we want to compare these approaches to environmental policy with 3 and maybe even 4 metrics. What approach actually leads to environmental improvements? According to a recent article in the journal Science, only 60 out of 1,500 global policy interventions since 2000 have actually reduced carbon emissions. So 15 policies that are intended to reduce carbon emission, only 60 of those have actually done so. Second, even if they're successful, what are the costs, and do the benefits exceed the costs? Not easy to measure, but important to do so. For example, the Clean Water Act in the US seems to pretty clearly have improved water quality, but not clearly generated benefits that are greater than the costs. And then third, are there other unintended consequences? If we have climate policies that raise energy prices and cause energy poverty, especially in poor places, have those policies been successful? And then there's other effects that are much more difficult to quantify and beyond my scope of expertise. But what are the effects of markets or mandates on our conceptions of morality? What are the effects on culture? So one of our speakers, Peter Hill, is going to comment on the morality of markets. And before that, Gary Libecap, who's like PJ, an expert on property rights, environmental economics, environmental policy, is going to comment on many things from his new book called Where's Coase? Transaction Cost Reduction or Rent Seeking and the Formation of Institutions. Both Gary and PJ are tremendous scholars, and they're even better people. So with that, I'm going to turn the mic over to Gary Libecap.
Well, it's great to be here, and whenever you get a positive introduction like that, I'm always kind of wishing that my family was around to get the sense that Dad's a bigger deal than they think, but that's fine. As Nick mentioned, we're going to look at really the history of major U.S. environmental legislation with regards to markets versus mandates. A couple of years ago, as I was sort of thinking about the book project, and I've always been a big fan of Coase, and I thought, gee, why are we having this discussion in the first place? Because Coase laid out, as we'll see shortly, such an attractive way of dealing with economic problems broadly and externalities in particular. And so that was among the most cited articles in economics, his 1960 piece, and it was a primary mover for him earning a Nobel Prize in, I think, 1991. So in a sense, if you were from Mars and you looked over the positive arguments that he lays out, you might think, well, we'll march forward with those insights. And as it turns out, that's just not the case. Basically, with Coase focused on decentralization. As it turns out, most environmental problems are local, and there's some evidence on comparing local and broader range environmental problems, but most of them are local. And these are the places where you might actually see parties getting together to solve air pollution, water pollution, degradation of ecosystems, and things like that. And so he didn't draw upon specific cases like that. He had some parables, but basically he laid out how this could get around the market failure arguments that had been presented and really solve environmental problems through the assignment and exchange of property rights. So he really had a markets approach. And in a setting like this, as you've heard already, parties capture the benefits of this trade. Okay? And so they have incentives to lower the transactions cost of the residual claimants of the benefits. And so you will get an arrangement that is, at that time, depending on the technologies available and so forth, the low-cost way of addressing a problem. And so this is a very positive way of presenting things and problem solving. And it's a way that encourages innovation and response to shifts in costs and benefits. And it can have just kind of broad economic benefits because you free up resources in the way that Nick mentioned to elsewhere in the economy. You're not devoting them in sort of fighting over things in a zero-sum game, but actually improving things. And so this article in 1960 predated virtually all of the formal federal environmental legislation. And so, as I mentioned, most environmental laws environmental problems are local. Parties have information, and they have incentives to solve problems. Coase wasn't interested in who got the property rights, although those are difficult problems to solve. But the key thing that I think is underemphasized is that in a market exchange, you equate implicitly willingness to pay with willingness to accept. And why is that important? Because it aligns marginal costs and marginal benefits. And shortly, as I'll point out in my overview of major environmental laws, there just is nothing like that. There are no incentives like that within a mandated standards prescriptive arrangement that's tied up to most federal environmental laws. But that's pretty important because it then allows us to state whether or not environmental regulations are welfare improving. So you could still have the case, and I think this is the case for most environmental laws, that overall benefits exceed costs, but it's my impression that the marginal costs are far greater than the marginal benefits. So in a sense, the environmental rules and standards are far too extensive and excessive and too costly to be actually totally welfare improving at their particular level. So when I began the project, I selected three major environmental laws and began to look at them. And I could not find a single case where Coasean arguments were the primary drivers. Now, there is some Coasean approaches to helping previously set standards be adhered to at lower cost, and we see those in cap and trade systems and so forth. But in no case did the local parties have the opportunity to negotiate the cap and distribute the property rights in solving the problem. So I review the Clean Air Act, which is probably the most extensive federal environmental law, Endangered Species Act, and the Magnuson-Stevens Fishery Act. The problem with these, as Coase indicated, they're polluter pays, so the polluter really has no incentive to comply, or they're really not part of the thing, they bear the costs. On the other hand, we'll see in a rent-seeking setting, polluters can actually engage in the legislative process to channel rents from restrictions on entry to benefit them. So the other important finding, and you're probably aware, is virtually no federal environmental law has been reauthorized or refined since 1990, at least through the legislative process. There are administrative adjustments, but nothing formally through Congress. And so you might say, well, why is that, given that it's supposed to be providing public goods and a lot has changed since 1990, but they're mired in political controversy. And that alone suggests that these are not always win-win, but actually zero-sum games. And so the parties that expect to lose want these things revised downward, and other parties that expect to gain just the opposite. So I'm interested in understanding why. And so what I do is go through the legislative histories and law reviews and the relevant economics literature to get a sense for the absence of Coase. And so there are three problems that one of them has been raised already. Are the transactions costs just too high? And you see this a lot, this argument that makes Coase just irrelevant. Secondly, that we have to have standards to avoid kind of a race to the bottom. And then finally, environmental justice, that we can have hot spots that somehow would be leave certain unrepresented or underrepresented parties worse off. So first off, in terms of the transactions costs too high, well, as I mentioned, environmental costs problems are mostly local, so that's the setting where environmental problems might be solved at lower transactions costs. But in the legislative histories, I want to point out, I see no case where the advocates for legislation like the Clean Air Act and its various provisions over time and amendments, where they say, hey, wait a minute, the standards that we're proposing are the low-cost solution relative to localized bargaining. Okay? Almost always it comes up that localized bargaining is too fragmented and ineffective, but there's really no data as to support that notion. Moreover, the Clean Air Act, just to reemphasize the local nature of this, in 1970 was all aimed at local problems. Okay, the solving of particulates and ground level ozone, sulfur dioxide. And in fact, the most recent EPA cost-benefit analysis of the Clean Air Act, where they find that the benefits far exceed costs, emphasizes primarily the health benefits and property benefits of reducing particulates and ground level ozone. So these are local problems, local issues that might have been addressed by Coase. Okay? In terms of the back and forth waste, Ravesh has a nice paper in the Harvard Law Review sort of describing the back and forth and back between environmental advocates and agencies and others battling over this. That is very costly, even though there's no data to really examine that. A race to the bottom. These might occur. It's just they're never made explicit. But especially if we have localized problems, it's unclear why local parties wouldn't address problems. And there's a huge history of how local communities address local pollutants, particulates from coal-fired power plants and coal industrial plants and so forth. Okay. The country, under the Clean Air Act, we have national standards, air quality standards. It's a very heterogeneous country in terms of terrain, economic opportunities, and pollution. So it's unclear why you'd need national standards that requires that all communities, one way or another, are either adhere to or never fall below these standards. There's some analysis in the economics literature about the rent-seeking nature of this, Peshigian, Maloney, and McCormick. But I found a nice quote from the governor of Alabama sort of pointing out that they were restrained in the ability of firms to migrate to Alabama from elsewhere. And he has a statement here. It says, bring your industry down here, dump some stuff in the river. He was talking about the Clean Water Act. We want jobs. Okay? So local communities might have been able to make the trade-off analyses of extra employment opportunities and what have you. But they're denied that under these standards. And that's a type of environmental justice that really is ignored. The hot spots I understand. I don't know or really see why national standards would address and agencies would address that problem more effectively than local bargaining, because you never get that trade. It's asserted that there's needed. But one important aspect of environmental justice that you don't see is what happens to employees and communities when older plants have to be closed because they can't adhere to the national air quality standard, ambient air quality standards. Okay. And there's only one paper that I'm aware of that really tries to get at those costs. And one problem is that especially with older workers, their skills are not easily transferable and they can't move to new communities or to new jobs. And when they do move to new jobs, they're almost always lower paying ones in other types of work. So that's an example of environmental justice that you don't see very often. The alternative explanation that I rely on is from Ann Kruger, as well as Gordon Tullock. And then there's a law review by Coase, Revege, and Stavens. Kruger and Tullock are really talking about rent seeking in the political process and the use of the state to create and transfer rents. Coase, Revege, and Stavens are asking really, well, why among the standards do we see so limited cap and trade? So they're related, but not quite the same question as I'm interested in. But the point is that through the political process, you can identify who the agents are, and that's who I see when I look at the legislative histories. Firms, unions, environmental NGOs, and of course, politicians and agency officials, and they hammer out arrangements, and if they don't like it, there's litigation. But that's the process, and it does appear that the process assigns particularized benefits to certain groups and particularized costs to other groups that really do not link with any important trade-off analysis. So at the end, U.S. environmental laws are, I think, inequitable. Even though public goods are provided, they provide disproportionate rents and benefits distributions, and this violates Eleanor Ostrom's argument that you really need a proportionate one if you want to have successful collective action. Local citizens have more information, but they're not relied upon typically. And as I said, these policies tend to be I think, too extensive and overly costly. And so this is what we have with standards, without total or much broader use of markets. And so the question arises, well, would markets be a more moral arrangement than what we see through standards? PJ?
Okay. I'll follow up on Gary here. And he's really given us excellent reasons why Coase was ignored and issues that I certainly concur with. But I want to suggest that there's some additional reasons that we should think about. And I'm an economist, and I think mostly about efficiency. But there are other sorts of issues with regard to efficiency. There's the ethics question. And sometimes in arguments like this, the efficiency issue gets ignored because for some people in lots of situations, ethics trumps efficiency. And if a program is seen to be unethical, then the lowering of the transaction costs or saving on resources doesn't seem to be particularly relevant. So I want to take up another part of that. Oftentimes in the political world, markets are morally suspect, seeing that they bring out the worst in human behavior. You see unfortunate accumulations of wealth, there's exploitation and selfishness. You see that in the first Earth Day in 1970, in which there was a discussion, we need to bring attention to particular problems. And we need to deal with them. But the modern capitalism, the argument is, was not dealing with them. So we need a different sort of a mechanism. We need a mechanism that steps beyond that of markets. Markets might be okay for mundane matters like potato chips and white tube socks, but you certainly wouldn't want to trust air or water or endangered species to that argument. Gary's given us some reasons why rent seekers took over and why markets were often ignored. But generally, I want to take up the issue of, is the market kind of morally suspect? I want to suggest that there's three reasons why, from my perspective, markets are moral, why they do represent a moral endeavor. And on many margins, actually, markets are morally superior to mandates. First, I would say, and this goes back to Connie's remarks about individual rights, that capitalism really is based on a morally appropriate view of people taking morally appropriate actions with regard to their property, to themselves. That's a moral question. And if you think that there is universal human dignity, human agency, moral agency, what we call self-ownership, then that means that you control property and you take actions with respect to it. And so in that sort of a world, you're doing what basically the modern liberal order is based upon, basically a concept of universal human agency. So if you take that view, then acting appropriately with respect to your property is a moral activity. One of the things that's interesting in that world then, wealth is an indicator of your degree of cooperation, how much you've been able to help other people, the sorts of things that you've done to be a cooperator. Now, historically, wealth has been kind of morally suspect, and that was probably a fairly accurate view, because in a world in which it's maybe zero growth, kind of a lot of zero-sum activity, and where rights are not well established, then wealth can be an indicator of rapacious behavior. You get wealthy because you're dealing with stolen goods. And for instance, a market for slavery is not a market that we should justify morally. You're dealing with stolen goods. You're dealing with the ownership, with a person's kind of self-ownership. So in that world, and if you go back to the Roman Empire or the Greek city-states or the Chinese dynasties, and when people would view wealth as an indicator of immoral behavior, that was probably fairly accurate. As in that world, you got wealthy by dealing with other people's rights. Unfortunately, we've taken that perspective and we've taken it to the modern world, which wealth is very different, but we still can see wealth as an indicator that you've been doing all sorts of wrong things. But in the modern world, wealth is again that indicator of your degree of cooperation. William Nordhaus, the Yale economist, Nobel Prize winner, looked at the U.S. from the latter part of the 20th century, actually 1948 to 2001, And he was trying to measure the degree to which entrepreneurs captured their social gain. I mean, they're producing gain for people by involving themselves in production and trade, and so he called it the Schumpeterian entrepreneur activity. And Nordhaus's data says that throughout that period of time, that 53-year period of time, by his estimates, the entrepreneurs captured between 2 and 4% of their wealth. Well, what happened to the rest of it? The rest of it went to other people in the society. So now in the modern world, massive accumulations of wealth in a property rights framework says you've done well for other people. Now, maybe you shouldn't necessarily go home and send Bill Gates or Mark Zuckerberg flowers or notes, things like that. It could well be that their wealth is an adequate reward for their caring for other people, but they certainly shouldn't be morally condemned. We should not see moral disapprobation for entrepreneurs because they are engaged in a wealth-creating, benefiting activity. So that's the first reason that basically a system of individual rights mean you don't have to, but you can participate in markets. Second, markets limit power. That's a pretty powerful sort of a thing to do. Power can be used badly. It can be used to oppress other people. In a market world, the only way you can gain power over other people is through the rule of willing consent. That's very nice. And in fact, I would argue that power is more constrained in markets than it is in the world of mandates. Power can be used badly, but it's more likely to be misused in the mandate world. Then finally, I'll just take up kind of what does markets do to human nature? And here, the charge is an interesting one because the charge is that markets encourage people to engage in selfish behavior. Selfish behavior is basically defined as caring too much about yourself, not thinking enough about other people. Well, the feedback loops in markets are much clearer. You can be selfish in markets, you can be selfish in mandates. But the feedback loops in markets are much more immediate, much more signaling to you what you can or can't do than they are in mandates. You can be selfish in markets, but you very quickly get some signals about your lack of care for other people, because that's what markets really are, is a signaling mechanism that tells you how well you are cooperating. So basically, as I look at the world of markets and mandates, I actually consider markets to be the one that I'm the most willing to defend, because that's the one where moral actions are rewarded, taking care of the issues of caring for other people. Now, it doesn't mean that markets are a complete moral statement. We need a robust moral framework to deal with all sorts of other issues, but I do see involvement in markets as an ethically appropriate set of activities. And in fact, I would say that Coase was a moral entrepreneur. He was making a moral system work better. And if you think the issues that Gary is talking about as basically conflicting claims over property rights, which was the issue with air, water, species, fisheries, the conflicting claims over property rights is what Coase wanted to try to resolve in order to make the moral enterprise work better. So with that, I give you that as another reason why Coase should be paid attention to. Thank you.
We're going to transition to question and answer for a few minutes, and I'll ask one question of PJ, and then I'll put it to the audience. PJ, what would you say to the critique that it is immoral to buy and sell things that are critical for human life, like water, clean air? Is that somehow different? Is that outside the
yeah, if you
scope
think
of
of marginal analysis, most of those things, I mean, would you want to force a person crawling across the desert and you happen to have a gallon of water and they are close to dehydration? You can make cases in lots of situations about situations that usually don't exist, but you can think of hypothetical situations where one person has monopoly power over a resource and making them pay their last bit of resources in order to get it. You may want to argue in those sorts of cases that markets shouldn't be used. Most of the time they're not. And it is freedom of entry, the sorts of things that Gary's talking about in terms of a property rights framework that takes care of those sorts of situations. It's pretty easy to construct these hypotheticals about, oh my goodness, would you want to force that person to sell their child into slavery in order to survive? Well, the society where people don't sell their children into slavery is generally one where you have markets that are producing wealth. So I wouldn't say that you necessarily want to imply or apply the markets always work framework. We need unselfish behavior in situations, but I just don't think that that's very relevant for any of the issues that we're talking about with regard to air, water, species, any of those sorts of things.
Thank you. So, Tracy.
A point of information, Gary, excuse me, and one question. There were actually 2 more reauthorizations of environmental laws since 1990, the Safe Drinking Water Act in 96, and some people consider the Frank Lautenberg Chemical Safety Act in the 2000s as a reauthorization, so you just FYI. Second is a question. I didn't recall you discussing the acid rain trading program, which you know, the Economist magazine claims it's a Coase in play. You know, OMB, of course, praises it as the most cost-beneficial rule. How do you view that in light of Coasean principles?
Well, it's clearly more Coasean in the sense that there's exchange, but at least the way I distinguish these is that in those cases the standard is set, so the parties are not negotiating what the overall level of environmental quality ought to be and then allocating a property rights regime to achieve that and a bargaining regime to achieve that. The standard is there. And these, the sulfur dioxide, acid rain, and reclaim in Southern California, I mean, there are hosts within fisheries. These are efforts to reduce the costs of meeting the standard. You don't get the opportunity to change the standard. In fact, these standards don't change. I appreciate the information on the other. That's always the problem when you say, when you step into an area that you don't know everything there is to know, and there's always going to be. But the major environmental laws have not been changed since 1990. I'm sorry?
You don't consider the Safe Drinking Water Act?
Oh, there you go again. I just have to make that 1992 or whatever. But I agree. No, that's very good. Yeah.
Thanks, Gary. I promised I would cheer your talk there, so woohoo. But also, I was listening, and I won't go into various details on fisheries, but I was thinking as you were speaking, do you think there's a fundamental difference between sort of political limits or setting limits between industry and government and science on goods versus bads, right? We like more fish. I would trust industry and science and maybe even government to work toward a sustainable harvest level for fisheries, much less so than I would setting a pollution limit. Do you think there's a sort of goods versus bads? Does that, you have an opinion on that?
Well, I don't see them as fundamentally different, although there may be attributes. What's kind of amazing, at least, and you know this, I'm sure that, for like 25 years, even though Iceland and New Zealand adopted property rights regimes to these things you can't see and move around, the U.S. did not. So it's 25 years before we actually put in a tradable right to fish across these different regions. And they're explicitly not a property right. And moreover, the assignment and exchange of them is very restricted, and the idea is to protect certain parties. Now, I see that same pattern, in the Clean Air Act and the Endangered Species Act, the sense of mandated constraints to achieve outcomes that are desired by certain parties.
We'd like to have more fish. We'd like to have less pollution. Is there some difference in them?
Yeah, I don't know that I don't know. I don't have a good, somebody else may have a good response to that.
Kind of the same question for both of you regarding devolution or taking policies down to lower levels of collective action, the community, the town, a homeowners association. To you, Gary, why is it so hard to do that? What makes it so difficult for these largely local problems to be confronted by local collectives, and why are they left at the top? I have my own answers, but if you could address that. And to you, PJ, can you make the case that when we devolve these collective action issues to lower levels, that we tend to have a more just or moral result than if we leave them at higher levels of collective action or government, if you will? Mm-hmm.
I don't know if they're more just, but they're particularly decided upon by kind of whatever their local standard of justice is that usually recognizes individual rights. But I just think the trade-offs are a lot clearer at the local level. And part of the move towards national regulation is a move that says that the elites really know better. And so I think the local level thing is relying upon people for sometimes people in higher echelons of power can't believe that the local people can understand those sorts of issues to make those sorts of judgments. So I do think that as long as you have a robust defense of rights, allowing people to make the trade-offs that they think are important is the way to go. But I just think there's kind of a general suspicion of people that on the local level maybe don't understand, the claim would be they don't really understand the science, they don't understand the trade-offs. If you believe that, you can give them more information. But you don't need to coerce them to say, doggone it, you are making this sort of a trade-off with regard to clean air and income, and we know you're making the wrong trade-off. So we want to take that away from you. I just think there's a part of an elitist moral judgment that the people at the top know more, and that makes them, quote, more moral.
Yeah, these morality arguments blend very nicely for advocates, because if you have a private gain that you can actually get through the use of the state, but you can make it sound more moral, then, well, all the better. Back to local actions. Now, I have to say right up front, I'm not an expert. I have gone through, especially with early particulate regulations in Pittsburgh and in other industrial cities, groundwater issues, that local parties, when they could set the standard, they would bargain polluters, pollutees, and they would have a sense of who owned what and whatever. At least in a Harvard Law Review by Revege on federalism versus local arrangements, he concludes these things are quite effective. Now, I don't know exactly what his standards are, but he's not one that says these are outright failures, as you often see. The difference now is, as PJ mentioned, with the standards, you have to negotiate within the standard. And then if you look at the provisions of the Clean Air Act, for example, then there are some aspects of that really constrain what locals can do. And for example, the prevention of serious deterioration or significant deterioration of air quality. So a national standard is set, and then areas that are above the standard cannot negotiate below the standard. Now, why is that? Okay, so it isn't a problem with local arrangements. It's the way in which national advocacy parties, firms, unions, environmental NGOs, and politicians and so forth have decided that they want the standards set up in a certain way and restrict the ability of communities to bargain around them. And there are explicit reasons for that.
Thank you, everyone, for being part of this session. We'll reconvene in about 5 minutes.